I'm Valerie. 3 weeks ago, I sat in a hospital room, watching my mother, Eleanor, struggle to form words after a stroke. Her first coherent sentence felt like a punch to the gut. Your brother, Travis, told me you didn't want me anymore. That single sentence shattered something inside me. For the past 18 months, I'd been calling, texting, and making the 4-hour drive to visit. But Travis had been blocking every single attempt. It all started when he moved back into Mom's house after his divorce. Travis was always the golden child in our family. Our parents, Henry and Eleanor, lived in a cozy 2-story house in a small town called Brookfield. Henry was a hard, working mechanic, and Eleanor was a kind-hearted librarian. They adored Travis, who was good at sports and had a charismatic personality. I, on the other hand, was more of a bookworm, focused on my studies and my job as a financial analyst. One Tuesday in March, I was at my desk, buried in a pile of financial reports when Travis called. It was unusual for him to call during work hours. When I picked up, I heard something I hadn't heard since we were kids, my older brother crying. His wife, Lisa, had filed for divorce. She got their house and primary custody of their 2 kids, Jake and Lily. Travis was in a bind, with just a duffel bag and a maxed-out credit card. Without hesitation, I told him to move in with Mom. She'd been alone since Dad passed away a few years ago, and I knew she'd love having him around. I called Mom that night and she agreed right away. The next morning, I wired him $2,500 for moving expenses and groceries. He texted back, thanking me and saying I was the only one who understood. 2 weeks later, Mom's best friend, Carol, called me. She said Mom was really happy and Travis was cooking dinner every night. But then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that Mom had taken a little fall. I called Travis that night and he laughed it off, saying she'd slipped on the porch steps and he'd been right there. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first month was normal. I called Mom every Sunday at 7 o'clock, just like always. She told me about the new books she'd found at the library and how Travis was helping her with the garden. But as the second month rolled around, the calls got shorter. Mom started saying she was tired, and she'd often hand the phone to Travis, who would say she was resting and he'd have her call me back. She never did. I'd been transferring $600 into Mom's checking account every month since Dad passed. It was for her little expenses that her pension didn't cover. Mom always used to thank me, but then she stopped. When I asked Travis about it, he said she'd thanked him and just forgot to tell me. I told myself she was just adjusting to having Travis around. In May, I tried to call Mom one Sunday evening, but the number was no longer in service. I called Travis, and he said she'd switched carriers and gave me a new number. But when I called the new number, it went straight to voicemail for days. I left gentle messages, but there was no call back. The following Saturday, I drove to Brookfield. When I pulled into Mom's driveway, Travis met me at the door. He said Mom was out with friends, but her car was in the garage. I called Carol, and she said she'd been home all day. Travis just shrugged and said it must have been someone from church. I stayed for an hour, but Mom never showed up. That night, I got a text from Mom's new number saying she needed space and I shouldn't come by for a while. The wording was off. It didn't sound like Mom at all. As the months went by, Mom seemed to disappear from her own life. She stopped going to the local community center, where she'd been a regular for years. I called the center, and they said Travis had called and said she wasn't feeling well. I also called Mom's doctor, and they said her last few appointments had been canceled. On Mom's birthday in September, I sent her a bouquet of her favorite lilies and a card. Travis texted me a photo of Mom sitting at the kitchen table with the flowers, smiling. But something about the photo bothered me. Mom looked thin, and there were stacks of unopened mail on the counter. One of the envelopes was from the local bank, and it sat there untouched. That's when I started to get a sinking feeling. I ran the numbers in my head. Mom had saved up $380,000 over the years. Her pension and Social Security gave her about $3,800 a month, which was enough for her basic needs. But without that savings, she'd be in trouble if her health declined. On October 14th, at 2:30 in the morning, Carol called me, crying. Mom had had a stroke, and the ambulance had just taken her to the hospital. I was on the road within 15 minutes. It was pouring rain, and I drove like a madwoman, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they turned white. When I got to the hospital, I rushed to Mom's room. Travis was sitting in the corner, sipping coffee. I asked him why he hadn't called me, and he said he'd been handling it. A nurse pulled me aside and told me that Travis had taken Mom's wallet and phone right after she was admitted, saying he needed to keep them safe. When Mom's eyes opened, she was confused and glassy-eyed. She tried to speak, and finally she said, "He told me you didn't want me anymore." I held her hand and told her I'd been calling and trying to visit. A tear rolled down her cheek. I knew then that I had to find out what was going on. Asked the nurse where Mom's wallet and phone were, and she said Travis had taken them to the car. When Travis came back with breakfast, I asked for Mom's wallet. He said it was at the house and it was safer there. I pressed him, and when I asked about her ATM card, I noticed a flicker of something in his eyes. I drove to the local bank branch. The branch manager, Mr. Thompson, was a serious-looking man in a suit. I told him about Mom's situation and asked to see her savings account activity. He pulled up the account and went quiet for a moment. Then he started printing out the statements. As I sat there and read the statements, my blood ran cold. There had been 260 withdrawals over 18 months, totaling $380,000. The last withdrawal was $350, taken from the hospital ATM just 40 minutes after Mom was admitted. The mailing address on the account had been changed 15 months ago to a P.O. box in Travis's name. Mom had no idea what was going on. I checked into a local motel and started analyzing the transactions. I found that $30,000 had been transferred via Zelle to an account under the name of a woman named Amber. I searched Travis's social media and found a photo of him with Amber at a fancy restaurant. It seemed she was his new girlfriend, funded by Mom's retirement savings. There were also $18,000 in payments to an online gambling site and $50,000 in credit card payments, all in Travis's name. I also noticed that the signatures on the withdrawal slips didn't match Mom's handwriting. I took photos of everything and started looking for an attorney. I found M.S. Foster, an elder law attorney with 16 years of experience. I emailed her a summary of the situation, and she replied the next morning, asking me to come in. When I met with M.S. Foster, I laid out all the evidence. She said it was a clear case of elder financial exploitation. She advised me to file a report with Adult Protective Services, notify the Commonwealth Attorney's Office for criminal charges, and petition the court for emergency guardianship of Mom. I drove back to the hospital, but I was blocked from seeing Mom. Travis had submitted a visitor restriction request, saying only immediate household members could visit. I called him from the hallway, and he said the doctor had told him Mom needed rest, and my visits were upsetting her. I told him about the money he'd stolen, and the line went dead. An hour later, I got a group text from Travis to our whole family. He said I'd shown up at the hospital making baseless accusations and that I was trying to take control of Mom's finances. Most of our family members believed him and sided with Travis. Aunt Sarah called me the next morning, scolding me and saying I should leave Mom in Travis's care. But I wasn't going to give up. I called M.S. Foster, and she said we'd go through the legal process. A few days later, Travis called a family meeting to discuss Mom's long-term care. I knew he wanted the family to give him guardianship.
Yes.
Foster told me to go to the meeting and bring all the evidence. On the day of the meeting, I walked into the conference room. Everyone was there. Aunt Sarah, Uncle Tom, our cousins, and Pastor Mike. Travis was at the head of the table, looking calm and composed. He started talking about how he'd been taking care of Mom and how she needed full-time care. He then asked for the family support to become her legal guardian. I stood up and said, "No, Travis. I'm here for Mom." I laid out the bank statements, the spreadsheet, and the P.O. box documentation on the table. I pointed out the transactions to Amber, the gambling payments, and the ATM withdrawal at the hospital. Travis's face turned red, and he tried to defend himself, saying Mom had given him the money. But I showed the family the signature comparisons and explained how he'd isolated Mom and lied to her about me.
Yes.
Foster then presented a letter from Adult Protective Services confirming an investigation and a cognitive assessment from Mom's doctor, which showed she'd had mild cognitive impairment for a while. She explained that under the law, what Travis had done was elder financial exploitation, a Class 3 felony. Travis's face went white. He tried to blame me, saying I hadn't visited Mom in 18 months. But Uncle Tom told him to sit down. The rest of the family just stared at Travis in shock. I looked at Travis and said, "You can pay back the money, but you can't pay back the 18 months Mom spent thinking I didn't love her." The next morning, Ms. Foster and I filed the emergency guardianship petition at the courthouse. The judge reviewed the evidence and appointed me as Mom's emergency temporary guardian. Travis was barred from accessing Mom's financial accounts, and all his existing powers of attorney were revoked. I immediately called the bank and had Mom's ATM cards deactivated, passwords changed, and alerts set for any withdrawal over $200. I also updated Mom's next of kin information at the hospital and removed the visitor restrictions. When I walked into Mom's room, she reached out her hand. I sat down and took it. For the first time in 18 months, she gave me a real smile. I promised her I'd be there every day. The Commonwealth Attorney's Office assigned Lieutenant Davis to the case. I gave her all the evidence, and she said it was a high-priority case. She also said she'd look into Travis's possible gambling problem. A few days later, Travis called me, crying. He asked me not to go through with the criminal charges and said he'd pay back the money. I told him he'd stolen $380,000 and asked him how much he actually had. He admitted he'd made a mistake and that he was drowning in debt. But I told him he should have protected Mom instead of betraying her. 6 weeks later, the grand jury indicted Travis on 3 counts of elder financial exploitation, 1 count of forgery, and 1 count of identity theft. His attorney reached out to the Commonwealth Attorney to start plea negotiations. I focused on Mom's recovery. One day, while she was in rehab, she asked me if Travis had taken her money. I told her the truth, and she started to cry. I held her and told her it wasn't her fault. Travis's recoverable assets totaled about $52,000. After a forensic accountant traced the money, the maximum realistic restitution came to about $65,000. Mom's monthly income wasn't enough to afford long-term care without her savings. So, I sold my apartment in the city and used the money to set up a care fund for Mom. The news of what Travis had done spread through our small town. People were shocked and angry. Amber, Travis's girlfriend, broke up with him and returned the money she'd received. Our family members started to reach out to me, apologizing for believing Travis. 4 months after the indictment, Travis pleaded guilty to 1 count of elder financial exploitation, reduced to a Class 5 felony. He was sentenced to 3 years suspended, 5 years of supervised probation, $65,000 in restitution, 550 hours of community service, and a protective order preventing him from contacting Mom without supervision. 6 months after the stroke, Mom came home. I'd made some changes to the house to make it safer for her. I hired a part-time caregiver, and I arranged to work from Brookfield a few days a week. One Sunday afternoon, Mom and I were sitting in the kitchen. The radio was playing old-time music, and Mom was knitting a scarf. She looked at me and said, "Thank you, Valerie. I'm so glad you're here." I smiled and said, "I'll always be here, Mom." Mom's bank account now has $5,000, a long way from the $380,000 she lost. But she's home, she's safe, and she knows I love her. I've learned that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even if it means going against family. And I'll never let anyone come between me and my mother again.